This lecture talks about Aristotle's view of the psyche or soul, and it's linked with the next lecture, which talks about Laszlo and Paul Davies and other contemporary thinkers' views of the soul. And I can't fit them both on one video, so um, they kind of fit together. Alright, Aristotle's theory of human culture has to be understood within the context of his view of the natural world. Aristotle's first love was biology. He spent a great deal of his life dissecting plants and animals because it was in this kind of work that he could most easily observe the underlying beauty and order of all natural species. Aristotle argues throughout his scientific works that nature is a principle or cause of order and of perfection in everything that has a nature. In order for any natural thing to exist, it must be a member of a natural species. Each species has a purpose in the world, or a niche, or a way of flourishing, meaning it's able to exist and reproduce itself from one generation to another. A species that can survive over time is said to have a niche. Aristotle would call its niche its telos, or perfect state. Because nature is a principle of order, not anything can happen. Whatever changes occur in nature must occur in relation to what already exists. The overriding order of species and relationships between species determines what else is possible. Some species are more sophisticated than others according to the kinds of activities they engage in as part of their way of flourishing. Plants engage in nutrition and growth and reproduction. Animals move and possess sensation to varying degrees. Some animals possess sight, some do not, and different animals possess sight to different degrees. The same holds of the other animals. The human species is the most sophisticated because human beings engage in the activities of other animals and plants, but are also capable of thought. Human thought is as natural part of the human species as seeing is a natural part of the species of birds. Just as the eyeball is naturally so-called designed to see, the human mind is naturally designed to think. This does not mean a designer exists who sets out a plan for each species. It means that no species can exist, that these species cannot exist unless they possess the kind of physical organs, such as eyes, which engage in those activities which enable that species to carry out its purpose in the world. The reason Aristotle loved to study plants and animals was because he loved to observe the principles of order and of perfection which underlie and control the physical properties they possess. He believed that while he was engaged in the activity of learning about the natural world, he was fulfilling his purpose as a human being. He was exercising the human capacity to understand. He defends his studies against those who would criticize biological studies as beneath human dignity. Quote, "For processes that are for something, and not a matter of luck, are most characteristics of the products of nature, and the end for which these things are constituted or have come to be counts as something admirable, and anyone who regards the study of other animals as dishonorable ought to take the same view about himself, for one is bound to feel great distaste at the constituents of the human species, blood, flesh, bones, veins, and parts of that sort." It is this view of the natural world that leads Aristotle to proclaim, "All human beings, by nature, seek knowledge. An indication of this is our esteem for the senses, for apart from their use we esteem them for their own sake, and most of all for the sense of sight, because it helps us to know things and reveals many distinctions." I think another way to understand Aristotle, which I've just thought of recently, but I think it's sort of obviously true, is that we are sort of the epitome of the creature whose telos, or perfection, is to seek understanding. But the whole evolutionary process is a process not just from less complex types of beings, and then from non-living to living, and then from living to having one sensation to the different levels of sensitivity the creature has. But the reason why the process works that way is because the species that are more sophisticated are more fit. They have better fitness. Well, what does fitness mean? It means that they're interacting with the outside world at a higher level. And when they can understand, know, there's when they're engaged with the outside world at a higher level, they can survive better. So in some ways, the process is a process to higher and higher levels of interaction or correspondence between the external world and the psyche of the creature relating to it. So I want to emphasize the main reason I'm including this is there's a correspondence theory of truth, that the powers of soul in any animal, especially human beings, has to correspond to what's actually out there. And it's because it did correspond that genetic mutation actually survived, because it was more fit. And human beings are just the epitome of that, and they can know that. The trouble is, they also have the power of choice, so they can also create all sorts of alternative realities, and they can actually self-destruct, and they can consciously do so. But the interesting thing is that the process of evolution is toward higher and higher levels of complexity, but not just for any reason. It's because they're interacting with the outside world, and that makes them more fit, and that means that they'll survive. Okay, Aristotle's De Anima is a biologist discussion of all the powers of soul of the members of a certain species, and how they should relate to each other so the species will flourish at its highest level. So when I talked about the ethics and politics, I talked about how a certain species flourishes within the context of culture. And the ethics started out with all actions are for the sake of some good. And so ethics and politics are these higher levels of development, because we're driven by ideas of good and evil, justice and injustice. But the De Anima starts out at a lower level. It starts out at just nutrition, the powers of soul we have in common with the animals, and then it ends up with the highest. So it gives you a hierarchy. And so I won't talk about the ethics and politics in this one. I'll talk more about scientific investigation and how that leads to a notion of a first principle, which is an ultimate power upon which everything else depends. And Paul Davies will just call this, he'll use the word God, and he'll call it a holistic concept. So it's nothing to be afraid of. I'm not turning into the word God. You have to be really careful about, because Aristotle's idea and his claim got co-opted by Christianity, and Aristotle is Western, and the West has become predominantly monotheistic. So he doesn't mean that at all. So anyway, here's a discussion of how all the powers of the human psyche are ordered in a hierarchy, and how they should relate to each other to develop the by nature we desire to know, from mostly focusing on the scientific side, whereas ethics and politics focus on the realm of human beings' relationship to each other. But I'll show you at one point, at the point of the human imagination, that's sort of the fork in the road where you deviate between scientific investigation and then cultural ethics and politics, and I'll talk about that. All living things have souls whose actuality includes nutrition, growth, maturity, reproduction, and decay. Quote, the nutritive soul belongs to other living things as well as humans, being the first and most widely distributed faculty. in virtue of which all things possess life. Its functions are reproduction and assimilation of nutriment, for it is the most natural function in all living beings, if perfect and not defective, to reproduce their species, animal producing animal and plant plant, in order that they may, as far as they can, share in the eternal and divine. By eternal, they just means continuous existence over time. For it is that which all things yearn after, and that's the telos, the perfect state of all of their natural activity. So it is this desire to persist over time. So it's this drive toward higher and higher levels of complexity, and also a desire to persist. Aristotle connects the most basic activity of the souls of plants and animals, nutrition, to the most fundamental principles of reality. Everything is as long-lasting, ordered, and perfect as possible. Further, these very principles lead to another thing. Everything is another principle. Everything is as intelligible as possible. The natural principles of the drive toward perfection, longevity lead to the ability of the natural world to be understood. Although human beings cannot understand everything about the universe and cannot take in every particular plant and animal, human beings can understand the overall principles and causes in nature and can categorize individuals according to their species. The human mind can grasp what is more influential, the underlying forces in nature and the universe, even though we cannot grasp every detail. Sensation is the next, more complex activity of the soul. Different animals have very different degrees of complexity in their capacity for sensation, and they differ in the number of senses they possess. Some animals possess the sense of sight, others do not, and those who do possess it to different degrees. The same holds true of hearing, smelling, and tasting. The sense of touch is the most fundamental. Quote, in other senses, human beings are inferior to many of the animals, but in delicacy of touch, they are far superior to the rest. And to this he owes his superior intelligence, because people are aware. It's the heightened consciousness that makes them sensitive to touch. Unquote. Each sense involves the existence of a natural physical organ of sense, the eye, the ear, the nose, etc., the object of that particular sense, color, sound, flavor, etc., and a medium through which the organ makes contact with the object, like light or sound waves. In the case of sensation, the external world provides the actuality, the sense object. Quote, sense as relative to each sensible is acted upon by that which possesses color, flavor, or sound. Unquote. The sense organ takes in the particular sensation to which it is adapted, and the soul of the organism responds by changing from potentially stimulated by the sense object to actually stimulated by it. Quote, the primary sense organ is that in which such a power resides, the power to receive sensible forms. Thus the organ is one and the same with the power, but logically distinct from it, for that which perceives must be an extended magnitude. Sensitivity, however, is not an extended magnitude, nor is the sense. They are rather a certain character or power of the organ. Sensation by nature is a pure potentiality. It does not create its own reality, but is activated by stimuli from the outside world. Aristotle describes what the sense organ takes in and what the soul responds to as the form of the object. And you shouldn't get too upset about the word form. I'll do it in some other kind of terms in a minute. Quote, in regard to all sense generally, we must understand that sense is that which is receptive of sensible forms apart from their matter. Unquote. This means that in a healthy organism, the sensations the living creature sees, hears, etc., are authentic stimuli from the outside world. Aristotle's theory of sensation is important because he wants to say that all the activities of the souls of natural creatures originate in responses to the natural world. More importantly, the punchline is the human desire to know is knowledge about the natural world. In order to be knowledge, claims about truth and reality must actually correspond to the external world. Although human beings can have many ideas that do not correspond to the outside world, they cannot call such claims knowledge. Okay, so the idea is that sensation is an activity, and as such, it's immaterial. It's holistic, is what the systems thinkers say. It comes to be in relationship between two things. So the object being sensed is not active, it's an object. The sense organ, the eye, is not active, it's sitting there. There has to be light, and then the activity of sensing is a kind of energy, okay? So the organ of sight potentially sees, but it doesn't actually see unless it's activated. Um, and it seeing has survived because there's something to see, and because the creature that could see was more fit, so they could survive. So the claim here is that our capacity to know evolved as a response to the outside world. And so we're capable of making all sorts of claims and thinking all sorts of things. But there really is a standard for truth. You should seek to understand what's actually out there. And it's possible and it's natural. And everything else is a defective form. You're abusing the organism. It's like you can't see. So they have this word for intuition as a kind of seeing. It's seeing with the mind. Okay. Further, in Aristotle's hierarchy of the activities of soul of natural creatures, the activity of sensing is more sophisticated than the activity of being sensed. So the most complex natural activities are activities we cannot see with our eyes. We can only understand them with our minds. Right? You can't see seeing. You just infer, you just figure out that you are seeing. Okay? It's a relationship. So the activities of the souls of animals both refer back to the natural world, to the material causes which are being sensed, and are not themselves material. The activities of soul are not material. They're activities, that energia, kinds of energy. The ways animals understand the external world reveal more about that world than the physical things themselves reveal. Right? So either the organ of sight, the eye, doesn't tell you anything about the world. The thing being sought, the thought seen, doesn't. It's the activity that tells you, that's the link between the creature and the world. This becomes, okay, the ways animals understand the external world reveal more about that world than the physical things themselves reveal. This becomes clearer as those activities become more complex. After sensation, the next most complex activity belonging to those animals who possess this capacity is the power of perception. This is the capacity to understand figure, size, motion, rest, and number. Although these are actual properties of objects in the world, the soul could not understand these properties if it only had the powers of sensation. The power of perception is the power to organize sensations according to the way the organism experiences them over time, which corresponds with the way those objects of perception actually exist in the natural world. So again, the powers of sensation evolved first, but then in that process of interacting with the world, this other capacity of perception evolved, and the creatures that had that capacity were more fit, because the world actually, sensible things actually have size, and they move, and they rest, and they are identities that you can count. So that's how perception evolved as a power of the soul. It first existed potentially, some genetic mutation, and then, because the universe actually was that way, it gradually became actual, and the species who developed it survived because they were more fit. The next more complex power of the soul is the power of imagination. Quote, imagination is a motion generated by actual perception. All animals take in the images of things as whole things, as material things existing over time, in motion, and with a certain magnitude. For some animals, the imagination stimulates appetite, then motion, and motivates animals to act in pursuit of their physical needs. The human imagination is much more complex. Some images stimulate human appetites and motivate people to pursue or avoid purely physical pleasures and pains. Some images stimulate human beings to formulate opinions and beliefs that are determined by desire and appetite. Because animals do not have the power of thought, all animals are motivated by images, by their imaginations. Because human beings do have the power of thought, their thought requires some kind of image, but if they act on their imaginations alone, they're being motivated by desire rather than intellect, and not living according to their natural purpose. Quote, because imaginations remain in us and resemble the corresponding sensations, animals perform many actions under their influence. Some through not having intellect, and others, that is, human beings, because intellect is sometimes obscured by passion or disease or sleep. So when we're only motivated by our imagination and not by thought, we're just acting like other animals. Only human beings have the power of thought in their souls. All thinking begins with sensation and imagination. Quote, as without sensation, a person would not learn or understand anything. So at the very time when he's actually thinking, he must have an image before him. For mental images are like present sensations, except that they're immaterial, in your mind. Children, unquote, children are motivated mostly by sensation, perception, and imagination. They imitate their parents' behavior or the behavior of those around them. At a certain point in development, however, in the transition from childhood to adulthood, the thinking activity of the soul needs to govern appetite, desire, opinions, and actions. The human soul must make a transition from being motivated mostly by sensation and imagination to being motivated mostly by thought. Emotions are necessarily connected to the body and have both a physical and a psychological dimension. Quote, probably all the affections of the soul are associated with the body: anger, gentleness, fear, pity, courage, and joy, as well as loving and hating. For when they appear, the body's also affected. So what he means here is there's a body chemistry. Our emotions have a chemical part to them. We feel the emotions because of our body chemistry, and we feel our body chemistry. There's a synchronistic relationship there. Emotions can be described either from the point of view of the thought which caused the motivation or the physical manifestation of the emotion. Quote, the natural philosopher and the logician will in every case offer different definitions in answer to the question, what is anger? The logician will call it a craving for retaliation or something of that sort. The natural philosopher will describe it as a surging of the blood and heat around the heart. The one is describing the matter, the other the form, or the essence. The philosopher should include both in the explanation. Now, which of these is really the natural philosopher? The man who ignores the definition and is only concerned with the chemistry, or the man who's only concerned with the definition? Probably the person who bases his concept on both, unquote. Just as soul and body are never separated in natural creatures, so also emotion must always be some sort of union of soul and body, or thought and desire. What exactly is this union? So I would say in children, emotion prevails more and the power of thought or reflection less. And then as you get older, the power of thought becomes more capable of controlling, guiding emotion. What exactly is this union? The soul itself does not experience emotion, but a person could not experience emotion without a soul. Okay. Quote, we say that the soul grieves, rejoices, is courageous or afraid, and also grows angry, perceives, and thinks. All these seem to be movements. Hence one might suppose the soul is moved, but this is not a necessary inference. Let us grant that grief, joy, and thinking are all movements, that each of them is a process of being moved. Let us further admit that the movement is caused by the soul. Anger and fear are particular movements of the heart. Thinking is a movement of this or of something else, some of these processes involving change of place and others change of quality. Still, to say that the soul gets angry is as if one were to say that the soul weaves or builds a house. Probably it's better not to say the soul pities or learns or thinks, but to say rather that the soul is the instrument whereby a person does these things. That is to say that the movement does not take place in the soul, but sometimes penetrates to it and sometimes starts from it. The distinction between the two sources of emotion, whether the movement begins outside of the soul and penetrates to it, or whether the emotion begins in the soul, is very important for human development. Okay, so let's just take an example. Anger, like I said about the ethics. We're very vulnerable. That's the human condition. We're vulnerable, and so let's take fear. We're vulnerable, so we fear. Fear is a reaction to our situation, right? So because of the human condition, this capacity to experience fear evolved because it's a response to our world. Again, there's a correspondence. So the soul develops this capacity for fearing. And then when you're in a certain situation, sometimes externally, right, some external situation triggers the fear. On the other hand, because we're thinking things and we have memories, we can just literally think about something and our capacity for fear can be triggered. So that's what, again, the emotions have a natural foundation, and our capacity, we evolve this capacity to experience them. But it has to be activated. What are the two things that activate it? The outside world or our own thoughts? Our memories, our interpretations of our memories, ourselves as reflective creatures. Okay. When the movement begins outside of the soul, the imagination is affected and controls emotion. When the movement starts from the soul, right, when it's outside, you see the image and you react. When the movement starts from the soul, human reason is the cause. Quote, clearly, imagination and judgment are different modes of thought. For the former, imagination is an affection which lies in our power whenever we choose. For it's possible to call up mental pictures, as those who employ images in arranging their ideas under a system based on memory, but it's not in our power to form opinions as we will, for we must either hold a false opinion or a true one. Okay, so he's saying memory, you can have any memories you want, and you can recall your memories, and everybody has different memories, that's fine. But opinions, if you want to make a claim about the true or the false, you're accountable. There's some reality to which that your claim corresponds to, and then you could be wrong. Again, when we form an opinion that something is threatening or frightening, we're immediately affected by it, and the same is true of our opinion of something that inspires courage. But in imagination, we are like spectators looking at something dreadful or encouraging in a picture. Okay, so we could have an idea about something, and it could inspire courage or fear, and we might be incorrect that that's actually a fearful thing, but the reason why it triggered fear was because of an opinion we had about that image that we called up. The claim that the soul does not experience emotion, but is the instrument with which a rational being experiences emotion, is also important to Aristotle because he wants to argue that there's an activity of the human soul that can outlive the death of the body. So our understanding of ourselves as emotional creatures is fundamentally attached to having bodies, but our understanding of ourselves as rational creatures can outlive the death of the body. Quote, thinking, loving, and hating are affections not of the mind, but rather of the individual which possesses the mind, in so far as it does so. Memory and love fail when this perishes, for they were never part of the mind, but of the whole entity which has perished. Presumably the mind is something more divine, and is unaffected. Unquote. And again, our emotions are, we have, the emotion of fear exists because of the human condition. Each of us experience fear differently because of our memories and our opinions and all the circumstances. So that would not outlive the body. Our understanding of the natural world, our understanding of first principles, our capacity to understand is universally true for every human being. And that's apart from our bodies. So he's claiming that that part could actually outlive the death of the body. Aristotle describes this process step by step. After sensation, perception, and imagination, the soul has the capacity for memory. Aristotle defines memory as, quote, a function of the primary faculty of sense perception, of that faculty whereby we perceive time, unquote. The act of remembering is, quote, the state of a presentation related as a likeness of that of which it is a presentation. Memory is a collection of such presentations over time. Quote, one must cognize magnitude and motion by means of the same faculty by which one cognizes time, by that which is also the faculty of memory, and the presentation involved in such cognition is an affection of the collective sense. Whence this follows that the cognition of these objects, magnitude, motion, time, is affected by the common perception, the primary faculty of perception. Okay, so, alright, so we have the sensation, we have perception, we have imagination, the image, and then we have memory. So, we perceive things, and we take in the image, and then we perceive time. We can place those images in time, and that's how we develop a memory. Thought, okay, unquote. Thought is a more sophisticated activity of soul than memory. Quote, memory belongs to the faculty of intelligence only incidentally, unquote. The first category, okay, because people can have a lot of memories without thinking, without having thought, without reflecting upon those memories. All right. The first category of thought is recollection. Quote, recollection is not the recovery or acquisition of memory, unquote. So when you're just remembering, like you're remembering your grandpa or something, that's not a matter of thinking or reflecting. When you're trying to reflect on the character of your grandpa or something like that, that's a different level of activity, different kind of activity of soul. On the one hand, quote, recollection always implies remembering, but unlike mere remembering, quote, recollection must imply in those who recollect the presence of some power over and above that from which they originally learn, unquote. Recollection is unique to human beings because it's a kind of reasoning involving inference. Quote, recollection is, as it were, a mode of inference, for he who endeavors to recollect infers that he formerly saw or heard or had some such experience, and the process by which he succeeds in recollecting is, as it were, a sort of investigation. But to investigate in this way belongs naturally to those animals alone which are also endowed with the faculty of deliberation, for deliberation is a form of inference. Okay, so let me, there's just plain old remembering your grandpa, for example, and telling stories, which is, again, just what you saw, the image, you saw your grandpa do this, do that. Okay, the next thing is to try and recollect the image in order to understand something about your grandpa. Okay, was your grandpa generous? Well, let me think of these stories. And you try to recognize a pattern and recognize if your grandpa has that character trait. And you can, if you use Aristotle's ethics, you can say, well, he gave money that time, but he wasn't generous as a characteristic. He didn't have that as one of his qualities of character because that was just an exception to his generally stingy character. There's that kind of thing. It's common sense. We do it all the time, but the key here is that we do it because we're trying to draw inferences. We're trying to see patterns in human life, and we're trying to gain meaning about human life. We do those things um, somewhat simultaneously. Sometimes people are just curious, intellectually curious about the scientific world, but eventually they come to realize, wow, I'm a intelligent creature in an intelligible world, and this is great. They see a meaning and purpose in it, or they should. And then, usually when we're deliberating or reflecting on people or human affairs, um, not too many people think, oh, it's just all absurd, one thing after another. I mean, sometimes people are like that, but most of the time they're trying to find patterns, meaning, purpose. They're trying to ask themselves, what's the good life? What's a better life? What's the worst life? What sort of choices are better and worse? All of that stuff is a kind of recollection because it's deliberately going back, remembering um, those images, those stories, those images in your mind, and trying to recognize what they mean. Um, Recollection always implies learning because, quote, acts of recollection as they occur in experience are due to the fact that one movement has by nature another that succeeds it in regular order. Okay, you want to find the pattern. Learning is the act of recollecting that regular order, either necessary or customary, which constitutes knowledge of some subject matter. Quote, acts of recollection occur when one impulse necessarily succeeds another. Now, if the sequence is necessary, it's plain that whoever experiences one impulse will also experience the next. But if the sequence is not necessary but customary, the second experience will normally follow. When we recollect, then, we re-experience that which customarily precedes the one which we require. This is why we follow the trail in order, starting in thought from the present or some other concept, and from something similar or contrary to or closely connected to what we seek. This is how recollection takes place. Unquote. Quote, accordingly, things arranged in a fixed order, like successive demonstration in geometry, are easy to remember or recollect. So let me just give you an example. Things like proofs in geometry follow necessarily. Okay, mathematics follows necessarily. Studies in the sciences follow with a higher degree of probability. Studies of patterns in human behavior are less probable. They certainly aren't necessarily true, and they're less probable. They're less precise because human beings do have the power of choice. Um, and then there's other patterns so some patterns in human behavior, though, are more probable and more common, and some are just arbitrary and accidental. And that's where you get the artist. The artist is the one that finds the patterns in human history and human culture and tries to educate people about that. Whereas other people just have arbitrary memories and don't try to make as much sense of things. It varies how much people try to recollect, how deliberate they are, how much meaning they want to find in life. But education and culture are trying to find those patterns. is the process of trying to find the meaning, the pattern, trying to learn from history, etc. Okay. It's natural for human beings to begin life observing the natural world with their senses and gradually cultivating the desire for knowledge. The fundamental object of knowledge is the universal, to find the sequence from one event to another that is either necessary or customary, but exists according to a pattern that can be understood. Quote, all human beings naturally desire knowledge. An indication of this is our esteem for the senses, for apart from their use we esteem them for their own sake, and most of all the sense of sight helps us to know things and reveals many distinctions. Now animals are by nature born with the power of sensation, and from this acquire the faculty of memory, whereas others do not. Thus the other animals live by impressions and memories, and hence a small share of experience. But the human race lives by art, techne, and reasoning, logismos. It is from memory that men acquire experience. It is through experience that we acquire science and art. So you see, memory, experiences, you repeat, you have experiences means, oh, I've done this before. You develop a sense of time, a sense of continuity in your memories. Okay, art is produced when from many notions of experience a single universal judgment is formed with regard to like objects. Experience is knowledge of particulars, but art of universals. Knowledge and proficiency belong to art rather than to experience, and we assume that artists are wiser than men of mere experience. The artist knows the wherefore and the cause. The master craftsmen are superior in wisdom, not because they can do things, but because they possess a theory and know the causes. In general, the sign of knowledge or ignorance is the ability to teach. Wisdom is knowledge of certain principles and causes. Unquote. Again, Aristotle says that the search for knowledge involves a transition from sensation and perception of particulars to using reason to gain knowledge of the universal. Quote, things are prior and better known in two ways, for what is prior by nature is not the same as what is prior to us, nor is what is better known by nature the same as what is better known to us. By what is prior and better known to us, I mean what's closer to perception. Obviously, we're a kind of animal, so we start out with sensation and perception and memory and imagination and memory. But by what is prior and better known without qualification, I mean what is further from perception. What is most universal is furthest from perception, and particulars are closest to it. Particular and universal are opposite to each other. Unquote. In the sciences, the universal sought are necessary for Aristotle, because Aristotle thought the natural world is a complex nexus of natural species interconnected with each other and persisting over time. Speculative reasoning is the activity of the soul and that aspect of human reason which understands the overall order of nature. Quote, now if thinking is like perceiving, it will either be some kind of affection by the thought object or some such thing. It must then be something unaffected, which yet receives the form and is potentially of the same kind as its object, but not the same particular. And the intellect must stand in that relation to the objects of thought in which the perceptive faculty stands to those of perception. It cannot have any nature of its own except just this, to be potential. That part of the soul, then, that is called intellect, by which I mean that whereby the soul thinks and supposes, is before it thinks in actuality none of the things that exists. Unquote. Okay, so we start out as animals: sense, perception, imagination, memory, and then there's this trigger, because the universe is knowable. We are the creature that evolved this capacity to understand. It evolved in connection with the world. We survived because it actually does correspond to the world. But we have to become self-consciously aware of that fact. But that transition from memory to recollection is what human culture is. It's reflective self-conscious awareness is what Laszlo calls it. There's lots of different names for it. Okay. During the process of scientific investigation, the scientist begins by observing physical members of natural species and finds out which characteristics or combination of characteristics can be joined together to define an individual species. Okay, so you just inquire, and the mind is seeking truth and can make mistakes. Quote, where truth and falsehood are possible, there is implied a compounding of thoughts into a fresh unity. Falsehood always lies in the process of combination. The principle which unifies is in every case the mind. So when it's investigating scientifically, it's trying to figure out which properties are essential to the species, which ones are accidental, which ones occur sometimes and not every time, which one belongs to every member. And gradually you just look at each, well actually you don't start out, you look at each creature and gradually you figure out how to define the species according what activities of soul, what properties together constitute that particular species as opposed to any other species. That's the process of scientific investigation, and that's a kind of unification, right? You're putting things together. Once the universal has been discovered, the educated mind should be able to recognize the definition, which is a description in language of what's in the outside world. So our language ought to correspond. That's the idea, is this constant desire to understand the world as it is out there, so that what's in your head corresponds to what's out there. When the soul is still using perception to observe individual things, it's still connected to the body. But when the soul finally recognizes, this is the key, you recognize, okay? So to cognize is just take it in. To recognize, you recognize the individual as a member of a species, and you can figure out what species they are a member of. This is a kind of activity, the activity of the intellect, which is not attached to the body. Quote, in the separation of the things from their matter corresponds a difference in the operations of the intellect. Unquote. As the process of gaining knowledge develops, scientific scholars can reflect back on themselves and think about the activity of the mind itself. Quote, when the intellect has thus become everything, in the sense in which one who actually is a scholar is said to be so, which happens so soon as he can exercise his power of himself, at this stage intellect is capable of thinking itself. Since the object of this, so people are aware that they're looking for patterns, and they're aware of this capacity they have to gain knowledge of the outside world. So it's thought thinking itself. You're thinking about your thinking. Since the objects of this kind of thought are immaterial, the activity of thinking these objects is also immaterial. Quote, mind in the passive sense is such because it becomes all things. So you're taking in all things. Your mind becomes all things. You create this nexus that reflects the outside world. But mind has another aspect in that it makes all things. This is a kind of positive state, like light. Then it reflects on itself, and it realizes, I have a mind that I can use at will. Mind in this sense is separable, impassive, and unmixed, since it is essentially an activity. So it's not triggered by anything in the outside world per se. It's triggered by our reflections on, our recollections. We recollect, we find the universal, and then we reflect on the fact that we have this whole system of universals in our minds. We can understand things, and this capacity to understand, the mind knows itself. To summarize, the act of thinking does not cloud our view of the external world, rather it illuminates it. Since the most powerful causes are the most removed from immediate experience, we can only know these causes with our minds. But we must begin to investigate with our bodies. If we're investigating accurately, we should have an accurate mental picture of the order of natural things in the outside world. Because the activity of thinking is by nature a pure potentiality, it can only be activated by reflections on our sensations, perceptions, memories, experiences, which come from outside. So, our reflections, even though we have the power to control them, when accurate, are a true reflection of the universe in which we live. The highest levels of thought are insights into the nature of reality and the nature of the human mind, which are always true, which cannot be proven, but which can only be recognized as the ultimate foundation upon which everything else rests. Aristotle argues that his principles of reality, that everything is this combination of what's ordered and then novelty emerging from that order within the context of order, is just an intellectual intuition. One recognizes that nature is a cause, that the universe is inherently intelligible, that this must be true in order for the universe to be the way it is, and for human beings to be able to investigate its nature and attain the knowledge human beings have, in fact, investigated. Further, Aristotle claims that in order for the universe to be as it is, in fact is, that is, ordered as much as possible, there must be a divine mind, a force, which keeps the motions of the heavenly bodies and of all moving things ordered and driving toward greater complexities simultaneously. Okay, again, it's not a personification. It's just these are the principles of being, again, within the context of which everything comes to be. So there's a force of necessity and a force of change. And this is just like the four, like E equals mc squared, and the four forces, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, uh, um, electromagnetism, and gravity, things like that. The physicists study the most fundamental forces, and then they have an impact. They had to exist in order for everything else to come into being. So it isn't, this isn't kind of odd. Aristotle's just saying there are these first principles. There is one first principle against which everything else comes to be. Or you could say this fundamental system within which things come to be. This God is impersonal and does not intervene in natural processes or human history. It is a pure energia, pure energy that sustains the universe. In addition to the speculative intellect, human beings also possess practical intellect, the capacity to govern their actions by thought. All action requires desire, and all desire is linked to pleasure and pain. We act because we're pursuing some goal or avoiding something unpleasant. The goal we pursue we think of as good, and those things we avoid we think of as evil. Quote, to feel pleasure or pain is to adopt an attitude toward good or bad as such. For the thinking soul, images take the place of direct perceptions, and when it asserts or denies that they're good or bad, it avoids or pursues them. Unquote. Speculative thought can never motivate a person to act, because it's not connected with the body in any way. On the other hand, practical mind alone is not always the motivation for human action. Action always involves appetite, but appetite can be controlled by practical reason or can reject reason and follow appetite alone. Quote, the speculative mind thinks of nothing practical and tells us nothing about what is to be avoided or pursued. But movement is characteristic of one who's either avoiding or pursuing something. Even when the mind contemplates such an object, it does not directly suggest avoid or pursuit. It often thinks of something fearful or pleasant without suggesting fear. It's the heart which is moved, Action is prompted by desire. In the absence of self-control, it's not appetite which is responsible for movement. For the self-controlled, though they may crave and desire, do not do these things for which they have an appetite, but follow their reason. Appetite and mind are clearly capable of causing movement." Unquote. When practical mind is controlling appetite, it always does so with some sort of purpose in mind. Quote, "Because of these, then, mind and appetite are productive of movement in space. But the mind in question is that which makes its calculation with an end in view, that is, the practical mind. It differs from speculative mind in the end that it pursues, and every appetite is directed toward an end. For the thing at which appetite aims is the starting point of the practical mind, and the last step of the practical mind is the beginning of the action." Unquote. Human beings have to choose between being motivated by appetite and imagination alone, which is what appears to be good, and by mind, or by mind which knows the real good. Quote, "Mind is never seen to produce movement without appetite, for will is a form of appetite, and when movement accords with calculation, it accords also with choice. But appetite produces movement contrary to calculation, for desire is a form of appetite. Now mind is always right, but appetite and imagination may be right or wrong. Thus the object of appetite always produces movement, but this may be either the real or the apparent good, and not every good can excite movement, but only practical good." Unquote. When appetite is connected with sensation, perception, and imagination alone, human beings are motivated by the apparent good, by emotion rather than by reason. Quote, "Because imaginations persist in us and resemble sensations, living creatures frequently act in according to them, some because they do not have a mind, and some, human beings, because the mind is temporarily clouded over by emotion. Since human action always requires a choice between the apparent good and the real good, human actions do not occur by necessity, but are indeterminate." Quote, "Practical good is that which is capable of being otherwise." Unquote. Both tragedy and ethics focus on human behavior, on the things, quote, "which are capable of being otherwise." Okay, so let me just summarize this by saying, here's his sort of architecture of the mind. You have sensation, perception, imagination, memory, and then recollection. That's when thinking will kick in and you start deliberately looking for patterns. Okay, if you go just with science, then you can study the natural world, but it's different from any sort of judgments about good and evil, justice and injustice, issues people disagree on. So in science, you either get it or you don't, and that's why scientists, sometimes they think they got it, sometimes they make a claim about the natural world or the universe, and then some other scientist comes along and say, "Wait a second, I have another piece of data that undermines that," and that's great, That's one kind of process, and it occurs a high level of probability. There's an order in nature, much higher degree of order in nature than there is in human affairs. But human beings are also kinds of animals with appetite. So you don't even study the sciences unless you desire to. So there has to be appetite and desire at every level. And then with ethics and politics, that's the realm of human choice. And the corruption occurs in desire, and it gets connected to imagination. So we have appetite. Appetite affects, we can't move without appetite. We can't do science without desiring it. But those appetites have to be trained, and that's what ethics is about, training a child to feel pleasure at noble actions. And that cloud or the issue of appetite occurs every single experience you have. So every sensation, every perception, every image, every memory is tied